Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the delay. My fault. I didn't hit the right button. I'm glad you're all able to tune in. My name is Brian Smith. I'm a professor emeritus of Ripon College. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Politics and the People, along with my co-host, Professor Henrik Schatzinger of the Politics and Government Department. As Dr. Jennifer Cobbina Dungy concludes in her book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America, she concludes that we are living in an age of protest. Protest movements for particular causes have mushroomed, as we know, in the last several years around issues of gun violence, sexual harassment of women, environmental pollution, bans on Muslims entering the country, and the killing of unarmed Black persons by police. Dr. Cobbina Dungy has done research on those protesting against this last issue, the killing of unarmed Black men by police. She conducted just under 200 interviews of protesters in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown, and in Baltimore, Maryland in 2015 after the death of Freddie Gray, who was already in police custody. In her book, she discusses how protesters perceive their relations with police and the state of their communities, and how these other experiences galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement, which began in 2013. Dr. Cobbina Dungy received her PhD in criminal justice at the University of Missouri St. Louis in 2009. Her primary research focuses on community responses to police violence and the strategies that communities employ to challenge police expansion and end state-sanctioned violence. Her research also examines the intersection of race, gender, and how neighborhood contexts shapes crime and criminal justice practices. Finally, her work focuses on corrections, prisoner reentry, and the understanding of recidivism and desistance from crime. She has also served as an expert commentator on community responses to police violence and inequalities of race, class, gender, and their relations to facets of crime and the criminal legal system for media outlets such as CBS News, CBC News, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Politico. And so it's my great honor and privilege to welcome you, Dr. Cobbina Dungy, and thank you for taking the time for a conversation this afternoon on your wonderful book.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We're delighted. So for the next 20 or 25 minutes, Dr. Cobbina Dungy and I will engage in conversation about the findings of her book, and then open it up for comments, questions by attendees for 35, 40 minutes, focusing on the questions first submitted by those who registered and then those who are attending. And I'd encourage those who are attending, as we're speaking, to put questions of your own in the Q&A box, which we'll get to after the conversation. So let us begin. So Dr. Cobbina Dungy, can you tell us what motivated you to do this research? In fact, one of those who registered for the webinar, Catherine Schultz, who was an alumna of Ripon College, class of 1989, and who worked for many years in the State Department on nuclear arms control, she submitted the similar question, and she worded it this way: what made you choose to focus on Ferguson and Baltimore in the process of researching and writing your book? And what did you learn that was the most surprising to you? So the floor is.
Yeah, again, thank you. It's certainly an honor to be here before you all. And thank you to all the participants who are here, taking time out of your own busy schedule to listen to this presentation or Q&A. So in terms of what motivated me to get involved, to be honest, when the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray occurred, I was concerned. And like most people, I was watching on television and social media this great demand for social justice from many community members, particularly following the death of Michael Brown. And so I will say what happened in Ferguson actually felt a bit personal to me, because I actually had lived in St. Louis for 5 years while I was a doctoral student working on getting my PhD. And I lived a couple of minutes away from Ferguson. And so I cared about what was going on in the city, that I had called home, and I lived in for nearly 5 years. But I will say, in terms of what actually drove me to Ferguson, this opportunity to contribute, to do something really came when a colleague of mine, he invited me along with a group of other critical scholars who engage in social justice work and research. And he invited us to participate in a collaborative research project known as the Ferguson Research Action Collaboration. Basically, he sent an email asking anyone want to go to Ferguson and interview young people. He was going to St. Louis to do a talk on his book. And while there, he wanted to conduct some interviews with young people, those who were protesting. And I jumped at the chance. He had wanted to interview a few people and ask a handful of questions. I did expand it a little bit more, and I asked a ton of questions, and again, interviewed almost 100 people. So that's really how it started. I will say that, part of this group, this Ferguson Research Action Collaboration, we had a meeting prior to us getting going. And I remember, in this meeting, in this phone call, we were told by a sociologist who was had boots on the ground and engaged in activism work and protesting. And we were invited to take part in a protest called, it was the National Day of Police Brutality. And we were told it would be a good idea to take part. Most of the people we interview will be at this protest. However, at the same time, we were told that if we go, there's a high likelihood that we might get arrested. We were told that we should wear running shoes because you may have to run away from the police, because at the time they were arresting a lot of people. We were told that if you go, you should also write the number to jail support on your arm in case you get arrested and they take your cell phone away. And I can remember at the time I was concerned. At the time, I had never taken part in a protest. I personally wanted to go to this National Day of Police Brutality to observe what was going on. I knew that a number of people who I interviewed would be there. And so when I'd be interviewing them and they're telling me about what's going on, I wanted to be able to understand and visualize in my head, how this scene looks. But I was concerned. And I remember I had called my pastor at the time, and reached out to him and asked him, I was like, listen, I have this opportunity to go to Ferguson and conduct a bunch of interviews. I want to go. I also have an opportunity to go and observe a protest, but I'm being told I might get arrested. I'm being told I might have to, if I'm going to go, I should definitely wear running shoes and write the number to jail support in my arm. And I was like, I'm a little bit scared. Do you think I should go? And my pastor at the time in St. Louis had told me, he's like, Jennifer, you're right. If you go, you might get arrested. There were a number of people at the time. This was during the crux of protests who had been arrested. And I was telling him, I was like, but I'm not going to do anything. All I'm going to do is go and observe and see what's going on. He said, but it might happen. And he's like, yeah, you should probably write the number to jail support as well as my number on your arm in case you do get arrested. He also was very involved in social justice related issues and trying to promote equity. And so I was like, do you think I should go? And he's like, Jennifer, just come, just come. And so as a result, I packed up my bags and I went. But that's how that started, and why I ended up going to Ferguson. I will say,
we're just delighted that you did, and we're glad you're here now.
Yeah. I will say 8 months later, in terms of, Freddie Gray ended up, unfortunately, he was shot he ended up dying at the hands of police officers, or during police custody. He died. And I also thought this would be a good opportunity to interview protesters and residents, because now this would be a good way for me to understand both the similarities and differences across place. And so in the book, I end up exploring protesters and residents' experiences with police across race, across gender, and across place. But in answer to the other question about what surprised me, I will say what surprised me is during the interviews, when I came and I started coding everything, I found that 25% of people who I talked to did perceive that if we hired more Black officers, this would be better. It would help to Black officers would be more likely to try to enforce the law more fairly than white officers. And when I looked more closely, I realized that this was coming from residents of Ferguson. In Ferguson, people perceived hiring more Black officers would help, but they didn't have direct contact with officers with Black officers, because at the time of Michael Brown's death, at that time, over 90% of the police department in Ferguson was white. So very few Ferguson residents actually had direct encounters with Black officers, but they perceived that if we hired more Black officers, it would help. Interestingly enough, and here's what actually surprised me, another 25% actually stated that African-American officers can operate just as aggressively when they encounter Black civilians. And when I looked again more closely, I found that these sentiments were much more common among Black Baltimoreans, those who resided in Baltimore, who were Black, and they had direct encounters with Black officers. And so that was what was most surprising for me. And
almost half of the police in Baltimore, you found, were Black.
Yes, and so that's the key. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, nearly half. So in contrast to the Ferguson Police Department, right?
Right.
And so that's actually what led me to conclude that while hiring more Black and brown people looks good, and it's certainly good for diversity, right? But I do argue that we can't just make the assumption that simply hiring more Black officers will result in them knowing the neighborhood better or not engaging in bias policing.
Because in the book, you point out that they are socialized, once they join the police, and they're expected to be loyal to what their superiors tell them, and they pick up all the attitudes of other police. Yes. So they live in a culture different from maybe where they grew up.
Yes, absolutely. And I really am trying to make the case that the broader issue are these systemic issues, the culture of policing, right? And the reality is, every objective investigation of a U.S. law enforcement agency through the Department of Justice find that the police, as a policy, often treat African Americans with contempt. And then we found this in the Department of Justice, found this in Ferguson, in Baltimore, in Chicago, New York, LA, Cleveland, San Francisco, and a host of other cities where they found that the official practice of police departments includes violating the rights of African Americans. And so that is, the police will often wound or kill or pepper spray or beat or detain or frisk or handcuff and use dogs on African Americans in circumstances in which they do not do the same towards white people.
Well, when you talk in your book about the motives for why some of the protesters joined these protests, there were various motives, but one of them you mentioned is that they saw those incidents of Freddie Gray and Michael Brown, not as isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that they knew about, they experienced. So can you talk a little more about their motivations? Why did they come out to protest?
Yeah, so I appreciate you mentioning that. So just like what you said, one reason is that they did believe that the incident regarding Michael Brown and Freddie Gray, they were not isolated incidents, they were victims of injustice. And so either they themselves, the residents or protesters that I spoke with, they themselves had been victims of police harassment, surveillance, or violence, or they knew family members, friends, neighbors, or coworkers who were the recipients of such acts by law enforcement. And so these indirect experiences are often internalized as if they were experiencing it directly. So that's one reason. The other motivating factor that led people to protest is many felt an overwhelming obligation to protest because they understood that failure to do so would result in more Black people dying at the hands of the police. And so, as a result, approximately 2/3 of the people in my study who protested back then, they were first-time protesters. And then finally, people protested because they wanted to achieve change. They wanted to put an end to police violence and systemic racism that exists in this country.
Right. You found that at least 2/3 of your people that you interviewed had very bad experiences, and recounted those to you about the police. But you found about a third of them, I think, that said that they had positive experience, and primarily the white people that you interviewed had better experiences. Yeah. But even some of the blacks, I think, said they had good experiences because they were concerned about crime in their neighborhood. You want to say more about that?
Yeah. So yeah, certainly the vast majority of people, particularly the African Americans who I interviewed, talked about having negative encounters with the police. That is, 2/3 of the people I talked with said encounters with the police are negative. But 1/3 of those interactions were said to be positive in nature. So during those times, people talked about if they were, for example, victims of property crimes such as burglary or theft, they would call the police. And they did say that there was a quick response time from police officers, and that officers did appear concerned when they approached the scene. And so some did appreciate that. I will say the other theme that arose as it relates to positive encounters people had with the police is saying that just when they had encounters with the police, it was void of assault, physical assault or verbal assault. That's a little interesting because there were some who just said they are well aware that Black individuals are generally susceptible or vulnerable to being treated with contempt, or being treated disrespectfully, or being assaulted. And so as a result, some of them saw encounters being void of assault as a positive interaction, or as they would categorize it as being positive in nature. I'm not sure if I would, because I feel like the bar is really low, but I still categorize that as positive because that's how some of the respondents in the study categorized it and said, well, I've had a lot of encounters with the police, but at least it was void of assault. At least it was void of being treated disrespectfully.
In your book, you talk about the contextual or structural characteristics of some of these neighborhoods that are the background for community police relations. And you talk about, if we're going to have a solution, we have to look at structural issues of housing, of education, poverty, of unemployment. We can't just throw more money either at the police or in the criminal justice system. You see this as a systemic issue in order to improve not only the quality of life in these communities, but also better relationships between community and police are going to require some systemic changes in the quality of life. Can you talk more about that? And I know in your conclusions to the book, you make some recommendations for that, and maybe you could explain some of those for us.
Sure. So I do mention that it's so important that we address the root causes of crime rather than merely addressing the symptoms. And the reality is crime is symptomatic of much larger societal problems. So in areas where we see high rates of crime, not surprisingly, we also see high rates of unemployment, high rates of underemployment, high rates of poverty, homelessness. We see poor quality schools and lack of resources. But yet, decades of research also shows what works to prevent crime. If we want to reduce juvenile justice involvement, we need to support families. If we want to reduce homelessness, then we need to provide affordable housing. If we want to reduce drug overdose, then we need to provide drug treatment. If we want to reduce joblessness, then we need to provide jobs. And if we want to reduce poverty, we need to provide jobs that pay a living wage, right? So the key is to ameliorate the conditions that give rise to high levels of crime. And I argue it's inappropriate to expect the police to address all of societal's problems. The reality is we look to the police to solve issues of abuse, abandonment, unemployment, housing, school disruptions, domestic violence, you name it, we heavily rely on the police for these issues. And so I'm arguing about the need to really focus on prevention initiatives, right? And where in the conclusion section of the book, I have us imagine, right? Imagine that rather than being tough on crime, which we as a country, we've been tough on crime for decades by investing heavily in policing and imprisonment as a way of solving so many of the structural problems, which do unfortunately disproportionately affect Black and Brown people. So I have us, I imagining. So what if instead of being tough on crime, we're tough on the underlying issues that criminalize people?
Right.
And so let's imagine if resources were distributed away from the criminal legal system and into communities. And let's imagine if funds were spent on prevention and intervention initiatives for young people and youth who are at risk, but yet who also have much promise, right? And imagine if these dollars were spent on addressing issues such as mental health and substance abuse and homelessness. Because currently the way we treat these individuals is we typically ostracize them, we demonize them, and then we criminalize them. And so imagine if resources were spent on bringing more jobs into the community, jobs that paid a living wage and where quality education is provided. And so that's why I do start to make a case about the importance of reallocating or redirecting funds that are typically allocated to police departments, and then reallocating it towards social service agencies such as education and healthcare and housing and employment opportunities and youth services. Because when we start to do that, then we can start to address some of the root causes of from engaging in criminal behavior in the first place.
Yeah, and it strikes me that by your suggestions, you're really helping the police, because you're not only taking tremendous burdens off their shoulders, they're not trained to be social workers or educators or mental health experts. And by having the community and the larger nation focus more on these issues and put some resources into them, you will make it easier for the police to do their job and increase and improve their relationships with the local community. So it's a win-win situation. It's not an attack on the police. It's relieving them of things that we have burdened them with that they're really not prepared, or do they want to do, but they're the only ones that are doing it.
Absolutely. And so I'm always careful to acknowledge the reality is, we know when we talk about reallocating funds away from the police department, I'm well aware it's so controversial, but I also try to be very intentional about addressing there are actually some commonalities between, police officers and even what is being proposed when it comes to reimagining the role of police, right? So as I mentioned, the reality is we depend on the police to solve there's so many structural and social problems, and many officers themselves will admit that we unfairly look to them to solve all of societal ills. Many officers themselves will agree that they are not well suited to deal with issues pertaining, for example, to drug overdose and mental health addiction. Their job is to enforce the law and essentially arrest and detain, right? And so we can do that, and we've been doing that, but we're still not getting at the root cause to ensure that individuals are having their specific needs being met.
I have two more questions before we go to our attendees and registrants with their questions. You mentioned Black Lives Matter was energized after the Ferguson and Baltimore incidents. But as you know, that has become a controversial term for many Americans. And sometimes media and even some politicians call that Black Lives Matter a racist group because they hate whites. Can you put the movement into a wider context? How do you see not only Black Lives Matter, but all its affiliated Black liberation organizations that have sprung up around it in order to help the communities of minority?
Yeah. So the Black Lives Matter movement really is seeking social justice. It's not just a civil rights movement, but they would argue they're a human rights movement that advocates for cultural dignity, respect, and social justice for all people, including oppressed groups, which entails Black people. And so, the movement has been fighting for a fundamental reordering of society in which oppressed people, including Black lives, are free from systemic dehumanization. And so Black Lives Matter does believe that every single life matters. That is actually the premise of the movement. They want for all lives to matter. But in this point in history, all lives do not matter, right? And we know that, and we see that from various institutions that exist, from the criminal justice system, educational system, employment system, housing system, all these inequities that exist where Black people are often found at the bottom of this, getting the short end of the stick, the bottom of the hierarchy. And so We see it in the ways in which white supremacy has been galvanized, that Black lives has not mattered or has not been valued. And so what the movement states is that when Black lives matter, then all lives matter. And so I actually saw a sign that does a really good job kind of capturing what the movement is. For those who don't understand, it says, we said Black lives matter. We never said only Black lives matter. We know all lives matter. We just need your help with Black Lives Matter, for Black lives are in danger.
Thank you for that. One final question. Since your research was completed, unfortunately, fatal shootings by police have continued in this country at a rate of about 1,000 a year. And the rate of Black Americans being shot continues to be more than twice the rate of white Americans. Do you see, since you've done your research in Ferguson and Baltimore, any progress being made to hold police accountable and also to address some of these root causes of public disorder and frustration in minority communities? Well, do you see anything that has happened in the past few years that's hopeful?
So what we've seen are greater calls for police accountability, right? We've seen calls to end qualified immunity. So qualified immunity, this is the legislation that prevents legitimate civil lawsuits from being heard when an officer violates constitutional rights. And there's a push to that qualified immunity should be abolished. We've seen calls to hold police accountable by restructuring civilian payouts for police misconduct. So currently, civilian payouts are paid through general city funds and not police department budgets. And so that means taxpayers, we are the ones who are on the hook for paying for this. And cities have paid out millions of dollars for police misconduct. And even, sociologist Rashawn Ray recommends shifting payouts away from taxpayer money to police department insurance policies. And this is a very similar approach taken in healthcare when surgery goes wrong in the operating room. And so comparable to the civil liability that hospitals have, police departments should have accountability rather than being absolved completely from financial culpability. That is both the individual officer who violates a person's constitutional rights, as well as the police department should be held liable. We've seen greater calls for the need to drastically shift police unions. We know that police unions play a major role in shielding officers and make it all but impossible to really remove an officer from the force despite repeated shootings and other major infractions. And so the union contract, all in the name of due process, has made it incredibly difficult to remove officers whose records indicate that they have engaged in serious misconduct. And there's also been greater calls for a national database. That is, officers who are terminated due to misconduct or who resign while under investigation need to be placed on a national database. And individual officers who are responsible for these harms should be held accountable. And then there have been calls in 2020 in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. There was the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020. And so the House of Representatives passed this bill. It didn't pass the Senate, but it's one of the most progressive police reforms that we've had in American history. And so it's a comprehensive set of civil rights and police reform bill that essentially it holds all law enforcement officers accountable for their actions. It does end qualified immunity for police officers so that individuals can recover damages in civil court when an officer violates their constitutional rights. It bans chokeholds and no-knock warrants. It ends racial and religious profiling. It establishes uniform policies for the use of force. And that is, changing the use of force standard from reasonable, which is a nebulous term, to necessary. It limits the transfer of military equipment to local and state police departments. It mandates data collection on police encounters, as well as requires body-worn cameras. So these are, so this bill really does create a lot of accountability for officers. And these are just some of the calls that have been made to hold officers, with making sure that officers are being held accountable.
Good. Well, thank you. Let's move now to some of the questions that we've received, both from those who registered ahead of time and from those who are attending. And as we go through these, I'd encourage attendees now, put some questions in either the chat box or the Q&A, and we will certainly get to them. The first question, which was submitted by a registrant, Scott Dix, who was an alumnus of Ripon College, 1974. I think I sent you that question. I'm having a little trouble with exactly what he means, but let me read it to you. He says, how do you resolve the initial reporting and the final facts? For example, no one ever said, hands up, don't shoot, and that the person who said that, it was said it was not prosecuted. Now, you told me earlier that you knew what he was getting at, and maybe you could clarify it for the rest of us. What was he really asking?
So I believe that Scott is asking, so basically, and even my book is called Hands Up, Don't Shoot, right? And so what Scott, I believe, is saying is that the Department of Justice, they issued a specific report about the shooting of Michael Brown by former officer Darren Wilson in the Ferguson Police Department. And this is known as the Wilson Report, and it was found that Michael Brown did not have his hands up when he was shot by Darren Wilson. And so I do want to, and so I believe Scott is asking me, how do I reconcile that? And so I do want to say, you know, this report that was done by the Department of Justice, which again, it was about the shooting of Michael Brown by Darren Wilson. And so this report, the Wilson Report, found that Officer Wilson's shooting of Michael Brown did not meet Justice Department standards for criminal prosecution. And that is because they believe that Wilson had reasonably perceived a threat from Michael Brown. In this report, I will say, quote, it stated that while Brown did not use a gun on Wilson at the SUV, his aggressive actions would have given Wilson reason to at least question whether he might be armed, as would his subsequent forward advance and reach towards his waistband. This is especially so in light of the rapidly evolving nature of the incident. Wilson did not have time to determine whether Brown had a gun and was not required to risk being shot himself in order to make a definitive assessment, end quote. So the Wilson Report cites case law that allows an armed police officer to kill an unarmed suspect in self-defense. And it did discount the credibility of witnesses who said that Michael Brown was shot despite having his hands up in surrender. But I also want to address, and this is going to go a little deeper than Scott's question, because there was that report, what we call the Wilson Report, right? But there was also another report. The Department of Justice conducted their own independent investigation of the Ferguson Police Department. This is known as the Ferguson Report. And so the Department of Justice concluded that if the Ferguson, they actually concluded that the Ferguson Police Department engaged in a pattern of unconstitutional, racially biased policing. They found bias against Black people affected nearly every aspect of Ferguson police and court operations. So specifically, they found that 90% of the time that police officers in the Ferguson Police Department used force, it was against African Americans. Every single time they deployed a police dog to bite a suspect, the suspect was Black. And so the Ferguson Report shows a police department that is discriminatory and racist, that consistently use excessive violence against Black people. In contrast, the Wilson Report, the first report I was talking about, found that a white officer of the Ferguson Police Department acted legally when he shot an unarmed Black man. And so what's interesting is that the Ferguson Report relied on data and stories to present a troubling case of a police department that has targeted Black people. But the Wilson Report relied on law to suggest that Officer Wilson's act of killing an unarmed Black man was not illegal. So the point I'm trying to make is that there really is no direct contradiction between the two reports, because it is, what we're seeing is that it is possible, even in a racist, discriminatory, and brutal police department, like the Ferguson Police Department at the time, it is possible that even in this department, a shooting of an unarmed Black man can be justified. But when you read these reports together, you will see a problematic reality. That reality is that it is possible for police to selectively invoke their power against Black residents and at the same time act consistently within the law. So it is why we see so few officers prosecuted when they shoot and kill an unarmed African-American person. It is within the boundaries of the law.
Thank you for that clarification. This next question comes from Jim Creston, who is a resident of Chicago. And he says, do you really think that fewer police in places like Chicago will really help? Being an 80-year-old plus resident, I have seen things go from bad to absolutely terrible in Chicago. The problem when I was young went from the Italian mafia making money on alcohol and gambling and protection to the Black and Hispanic gangs now making money off drugs. It seems like it's a profit center, and I do not see how defunding the police can stop it. There's just too much money to be made. So what would you have to say to Jim's concern?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So I want to say when we talk about defunding the police, first, I think, let me just define some of the terms, because I will say defund the police is often used interchangeably when we think about abolition, when we hear about abolition, abolishing the police, or disbanding the police. So when we say defund the police, again, it means to reallocate or to redirect some funds that were traditionally allocated for police departments to social service agencies. So when we're talking about abolishing the police, that essentially means to get rid, right? To completely get rid of the police department, right? And then when we talk about disband the police, that means completely shut down the police force and start over with new protocols, structures, and training plans. So I just want to say, I just wanted to define those terms, just so that when I say defund the police, we're all on the same page, thinking about the same definition, right? So first, let me start off by talking about why there have been so many calls to defund the police. We know, right, in the aftermath of George Floyd, there have been calls to defund the police, which we also know is quite controversial. So first, the reason why calls are being made to defund the police is that we've tried various ways to train the police, from implicit bias training to diversity training to de-escalation training. And yet, despite the training, it doesn't show that it actually leads to change in police behavior. But what we do know is statistics show that more than 1,000 men, women, and children are killed each year by the police. Thousands more are brutalized and abused and disrespected. And we know that Black people, Black and Brown people, undergo a wide range of harms. They're the most likely to be the recipients of disrespectful treatment, verbal abuse, arrest, and use of force. So that's one reason. The second reason why calls are made to defund the police is that only 5% of, and a lot of people don't know this, but 5% of 911 calls have anything to do with violence. The vast majority of arrests are for low-level, non-violent activities. These activities are often symptoms, again, of underlying issues, as I mentioned before, such as substance abuse, homelessness, and mental illness, which many argue should be treated by healthcare professionals and social workers who have degrees, right, in dealing with these types of issues, as opposed to relying on the police. I will say the other thing that many are not aware of is that the clearance rate for violent crime is abysmal. Like when we look using the FBI's data, so the police data, right? What we see is that according to their data, 40% of homicides go unsolved every single year. 66% of rapes go unsolved every year. 70% of robberies go unsolved each year, and nearly 50% of aggravated assaults go unsolved. So it could be argued that reducing officer workload would help to increase the likelihood of even solving violent crimes, as opposed to having officers deal with some of these lower level issues. We know that police officers are overworked and overstressed. And so focusing on some of these lower level tasks and lower level infractions throughout the day can be an inefficient use of taxpayer money. And other government actors should be responsible for dealing with these and receiving adequate funding in order to appropriately deal with these issues. The other thing I also want to say in terms of why calls have been made to defund the police is given the amount of money we spend on the police force. America spends more than $100 billion every year on policing. That's 100 billion with a B, right? So according to data shows that from 1977 to 2017, we went from paying 42, where the police department was receiving $42 billion, and as of 2017, it was 115 billion. While at the same time, there have been cuts to social services, there have been cuts to education, there have been cuts to community resources, and there have been cuts to services. And police departments are usually the largest department in a city budget, and they usually take anywhere from 25 to 50% of the general funds in any major city. And so it can be argued that outsized spending increases on police is draining resources from everything else. That is, we are defunding social services and education and community resources, all in the name of continuing to balloon, the police department in terms of funding. And as I mentioned, with the clearance rates being pretty abysmal, with the fact that police departments, 5% of calls to the police are dealing with violent crimes, to the fact that the police departments have been and continue to receive training, and yet we continue to see these issues. That's why we're seeing calls to reimagine the role of the police and take a portion of the police budget and reallocating it to various social services, right? So the key is, I will agree, if we're just talking about removing police budget and substantially just reducing the police budget and doing nothing, that will be a huge failure, right? It has to be reallocated to services that will attempt to get to some of the, like I mentioned, the root causes of crime.
Right. This is another question from an attendee, Phil Aberrant, who is a retired psychiatrist, lives both in Wisconsin and Florida. And he goes back to the issue of police unions, which you mentioned before. And he says, police unions seem to have greater power than local governments. The issue of qualified immunity seems to protect law enforcement officers to an extreme degree, whereas the average citizen has no such protection against the police. What is the remedy?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. I think, as I mentioned, some of these remedies, as I mentioned, are, these calls to hold police officers more accountable, because Philip is actually very correct that the law enforcement officers they have a lot of protections, and it's actually really hard to remove police unions. And so that's why we are actually seeing calls. So in terms of what is the remedy, this is kind of hard, but there are a number of things. As I mentioned, there is the defund the police, right? That's one thing. I will say there are other departments, other examples in which we see attempts to rely less on the police, right? So for example, there is CAHOOTS. This is CAHOOTS stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. This is a program in Eugene, Oregon, and they handle about 20% of 911 calls. They started taking a different approach to nonviolent incidents that's caused by someone experiencing, again, mental illness, addiction, or homelessness. And so instead of sending an armed officer to respond to these issues, the city will dispatch a crisis responder to diffuse the situation and then connect the individual with services, because that's what they need. So what happens is they dispatch a nurse or an EMT alongside an experienced mental health worker and they deal with calls such as mental health episodes, public intoxication, that kind of thing. And in the process, they've saved the city millions in police and emergency room resources. That's just one example.
Right, sure.
And there are other models that are also being done as well in different cities that are not relying heavily on the police to solve every issue.
We have a question from one of the Ripon College students, Nicholas Richter. And he asks, can you compare and contrast the pros and cons of placing accountability on departments for police as opposed to liability of all individual officers themselves? And where do you think the primary accountability should be? I think that's a very good question, because frequently that's not done. That comparison isn't made, or we don't have enough discussion about that.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and it is a good question. The reason why it can't just be the individual. The reality is, most of the time, the individual is not going to have that much money to cover the cost, right?
That's right.
You have to also attack the department. The department is going to have more amount of money in their coffers to deal with these issues. So as I mentioned, there are a number of cities. That rely on where the civilian payout has been millions of dollars. So for example, Chicago, in the past 20 years, Chicago has spent $650 million in civilian payouts for police misconduct, right, over the past 2 decades. So I see advantages to targeting individuals, that if you engage in police misconduct, a portion of your retirement money is going to have to go, right, to paying to the individual's family who lost their loved ones. I say it's important to also address the police department, because the reality is, people often say, when we see these horrible issues of police killings, we reduce it to bad apples. But it's also been said that bad apples come from rotten trees, right? Or rotten departments. And so, again, getting at this culture of policing, a system that can often make it permissible to aggressively surveil and treat impoverished communities of color. And the reality is, if you live in a poor neighborhood where there's high crime, but you can't afford to move, high rates of crime, but it's a poor neighborhood. As a result, police are going to be in that area a lot. And yet, often it is not uncommon to be treated as if you yourself are engaging in criminal activity because you live in a high crime neighborhood. And hence, the disrespect, being treated with contempt, the abuse. And so, again, I appreciate the question. I do see advantages to pursuing both individual and police departments as well.
Right. You mentioned fear of crime. As you know, Jennifer, there's a perception by many Americans that serious crime is increasing. A public opinion polls last year indicated that almost 60% of Americans who were polled last year believe that we have a serious or very serious problem with rising crime. So given that, there's going to be a lot of pressure to just increase more money for police or more equipment for police. And a decline, there's a danger now, there's going to be a decline of interest in reforming the police and the criminal justice system. So how do you foresee those fears of crime? And there's certainly going to be an issue in the upcoming midterm elections. How will this dampen the need for more reforms and for, as you say, reallocating resources towards social services in minority communities?
In my opinion, I do believe we will continue to see increased funds going to police departments to fight crime. And the reality is, that I think there was a small window for, reallocation to take place. We know in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, there were certainly a huge calls. We even saw city leaders calling for defunding the police. But the reality is, in 2021, most cities actually increased funding in police departments. So I actually do see or perceive that there will be increased funds going to police departments. At the same time, I also know that there are a number of grassroots activists who are working hard behind the scenes to radically transform policing as we know it, and to radically transform justice in America. There are a number of activist organizations that are working hard to hold powerful actors accountable, including the police and police departments. And many are advocating for deep structural changes. Many organizations are pushing for bold policy changes to dismantle systems of injustice and replace them with policies and committees and resources that support healing and community care. So that's what I would say to that question. I do believe there'll be increases in police, increased funds in police departments, but I also know that there are a number of grassroots activists and organizations that are working hard to ensure, to try to ensure that doesn't happen.
Good. Our student, Nicholas Richter, responded, and he said, I asked that question, about the balance between accountability of the department or the individual policeman, because it is a great contention between Democrats and Republicans right now. And the whole issue of police reform at the federal level. So, he's asking a very, I think, timely question. And
absolutely.
It's not easy to deal with. But your point about all of the civil suits, and in your book, there's one statistic that you give, it's been $1 billion in civil suits that cities or local communities have paid out after police misconduct. And that comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. It doesn't come out of police budgets or the individual policeman. So something is needed to rebalance the system. If we're going to have accountability, we should also have financial accountability. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
And I just want to even emphasize to that point, the point you just made, Brian, like, I have statistics right here. So for example, and, when Breonna Taylor died at the hands of the police, right? Again, we see there's been a number of settlements. Settlements are incredibly expensive for the city.
Yes.
And so when Breonna Taylor died, family received $12 million. When, and this was in Louisville, Kentucky, when Tamir Rice was killed by an officer at the time, he was a boy, when he was killed by the police, the family received $6 million. Freddie Gray's family received $6.4 million in Baltimore. Laquan McDonald's family received $5 million in Chicago, Illinois. Michael Brown's family received $1.5 million. William Green, his family received $20 million in Prince George County in Maryland. So I want to just highlight just how expensive this is. And it is coming from taxpayer dollars.
Yes, that's right.
And so we really have to understand. And so no one individual can afford to pay all of that, but you are going to feel it if now all that you've worked for, your retirement, your pension, right? It's now going to support the families of the individual who one killed.
Yeah. We have a statement by Maria Mendoza Bautista. She is the director on our campus of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, which I mentioned to you before we began. And she has some nice words she'd like to share with you. And she says this. She says, on behalf of the Ripon College Center for Diversity and Inclusion, I welcome Dr. Cobbina Dungy and to this very important presentation you offer to the campus community. We appreciate your expertise, your grace, your presence in giving us clarity and unpacking this very important topic and recognizing racism and discrimination in law enforcement while acting consistently within the law, as you pointed out. We do appreciate you so much. So that's from one of our staff persons who does wonderful work on campus to include all students, particularly people who are minorities. So Maria, she is very appreciative of you, and we certainly are very appreciative for you for what you shared with us this afternoon. And I'd like to ask you, what would you like to leave us with, Jennifer? What should we take away? You've given us a lot to think about. You've given us a lot of information. You've put things in perspective. What would you hope that we remember from this conversation with you this afternoon?
I think a takeaway would be, which I haven't touched upon, is get involved. I am well aware sometimes, people want to help, they want to make things better, but it's also so overwhelming. And so why even try? So the best thing I would say is just get involved, whether it's in a local Black-led organization or just a justice organization or agency or movement like the NAACP, Black Youth Project 100, Southern Poverty Law Center, Equal Justice Initiatives. So many groups and organizations are doing a lot, trying to propose policy and funding changes and just really make changes to policy and practices and the law. In some cases, you can just sign up for updates. In other cases, they may ask for volunteers or ask you to take action when needed. In other cases, you can donate. Campaign Zero, for example, is a comprehensive platform of research-based policy solutions to try to end police violence in America. They have several evidence-based solutions to address police violence and to hold police accountable. And in doing so, you can then, if you were to sign up, you can then contact your city or town government representative, police chief to try to advocate for some of these policies. I know that the Grassroots Law Project, that's something I'm a part of, they also respond to state-sanctioned racial violence. This organization includes a team of grassroots organizers, legal experts, all of whom are committed to trying to transform the criminal legal system. And so you can become part of their working group where you can volunteer a few hours of your time each week to try to fight injustice in our criminal legal system. So basically what I'm trying to say, I'm well aware no one individual can do this. And it is so overwhelming. It's like, why, what's the use? But there are a ton of organizations and movements that are really trying to bring about real structural, tangible change. And so you can link yourself and be part of these organizations to also try to bring about equity and ensure that systemic injustices, we're trying to dismantle those issues.
Well, we thank you very much for those suggestions and for all that you shared with us this afternoon. I think we'll be better informed about these issues and will not fall traps into quick phrases like defund the police or Black Lives Matter is racist. I mean, you really helped us to think about these in I think, a very balanced way about how to approach the issue of the quality of life of our fellow American citizens and how that can be improved and how that's a win-win situation, not only for them, but also for police departments that are trying to serve them. They'll be able to do it in a much better way if these structural issues are really addressed. So It's been very helpful and we want to thank you. Before we end, I have one announcement to make. The Student Advisory Board of the Center for Politics and the People, so this is the students themselves, will be hosting another Zoom webinar. It will occur next Tuesday evening, April 19th from 7:30 to 8:30 on the issue of immigration and citizenship. And Mr. Enrique Morones will be the speaker. He is the founder of Border Angels, a nonprofit organization that advocates for human rights, humane immigration reform, and social justice, with a special focus on issues related to the US-Mexican border. That's a very timely issue to discuss right now. And he has served as the executive director until 2019. Enrique was the first person to gain dual United States and Mexican nationality in 1998. He's also the winner of the Mexican Human Rights Award in 2009 by President Felipe Calderon, as well as Mexico's Othlies Award. So I would encourage the attendees to look for more information, which we'll be sending out about that Zoom. And this will be run by students themselves. They will engage in dialogue and conversation with Mr. Morones about the immigration situation, since you all know that in May, things are going to change at the border in terms of are allowing more people seeking asylum to come across and make their case in the United States. So thank you all for attending. Thank you again, Jennifer, for all the work you do on social justice and for informing us. And we hope you all have a good evening. And we thank you very much, Jennifer.